What's up, everybody? Before we get started, Jake and I were just talking, and we were talking about our sound check. And I gotta have this microphone. You can see just the tip right now. But Jake, we were saying, whatever. He's got a booming voice, and I said he's got that Barry White thing going on. And you said what?
I said, I prefer if you're gonna do that, go Chuck D. Like he's got my favorite, like booming MC voice. So I like that. But that might be flagrant. I don't know.
Yeah, right. We see you got a little background going on there. Is that
yeah, man. Always into something in this household.
Right. If you've been a watcher of us in the past, you might have seen their cameos periodically. Jake's dog is a regular, but one time his mom made an appearance too, which was pretty dope. Like I gotta say, like,
and let the record show. And I've said this before. Folks think that media personnel. I'm not a blogger. I've never been a blogger, but folks like to think that folks that cover the culture like live in their mom's basement. That happened when my mom made a cameo. I was home for the holidays, so don't get it twisted. And your dog has made a few appearances as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just a couple, but there's no shame in it, man. You say you're not a blogger. You ever watch Super Lover? The YouTube rapper. He says, "I'm not a rapper. I'm not a rapper."
No, no, I haven't seen that one, but that's funny. Yeah, I don't know. You and I have talked about that before. Like, my writing career started in 2001, 2002. The term blog didn't exist, and one of and you've cringed too. Like when somebody says, "Oh, this is he's a blogger," I'm like, nah, that's one thing. Like, that's a term I just don't care for.
Why is that though? Why is that?
Because I'm a professional, man. I've put in 10,000 hours. I think I'm on my, I think that I'm probably more on 30 to 40,000 hours at this point. And yeah, I mean, I've made a livelihood doing this, and I take a lot of pride, not just in getting paid, but when you do that, you have to fit into an industry. That means that other people, can work with your writing. And for me, as somebody that, has been a significant part of 3 different publications online, but also contributed to print. Like I'm a very, our colleague Justin Hunt once called me nauseatingly humble. And I've been working on that. But one thing that I will always kind of check on is don't call me a blogger. That's like calling, an NBA player, like a hooper. No, there's a lot more that comes with this than just making foul shots and threes.
I love that. I love that answer. And let's remember this, because there's something that we're going to talk about later on today. And there's a reference that the New York Times made in connection with someone that we're going to discuss that rubbed me the wrong way for the exact same reason. But I love that. I love that. It's a great segue. So what's up, everybody? It's Reggie Williams, founder and CEO of Ambrosia for Heads. And with me, I've got Jake Payne, our editor-in-chief, and together this is our What's the Headline podcast. So, yeah, man, we got a lot to talk about today. We started a little bit, but, I think it's only fair that we first pay our respects to someone that we lost a week ago today. We're recording this on Sunday. We were gearing up for the Super Bowl. Typically Super Bowl Sundays are very, very slow in terms of media consumption. Everybody's out like doing tailgating or buying food, getting ready for the big game. And that day is almost like an American holiday at this point. It's probably one of the biggest holidays, unofficial holidays right now, I would say. And around 3:30, 4:30, I started getting texts, and we were both out. I was in New Orleans. You were at a party in Philly, right?
No, actually, when it happened, I was sitting on my couch. I am in the midst of getting married and was having a very deep dive into all the logistics that go on with that. And I'm somebody, I think like you, often my phone is on silent unless there's a certain, something to watch for. But that day, to your point, even beyond football fandom, I think a lot of people just know that the the traffic and the attention online is limited. So you're not going to see new music. You're not going to see a lot of things. And we had covered something in the morning on AFH, but I was very much with the mindset of being done for the day, and got up and walked over to my phone to see, I believe the count was 28 text messages and a missed call. And yeah, we learned, I guess I can say it. We learned that one of my hip hop heroes, Dave, that's what I call him, and that's how I knew him as, Dave from De La Soul, had passed away at the age of 54. And yeah, I think you and I learned very close together with that.
Yeah, man. We've talked about this before. This is one of the worst things about our job because, we have real love and respect for this culture. And the reason why we're doing this is not for money, but because of the passion. And we grew up with this. A lot of these guys, like you said, I think hero is a great word for it, are our heroes. And we've been fortunate enough to make some peers and even friends, so to get news like this is like deeply impactful. And unlike others where you can start to kind of mourn and grieve and process, we first got to react and think about, okay, how are we going to frame this person's life that has meant so much to us and so much to so many people in 500 words, and do it in like 30 minutes to 60 minutes. And, how are we going to do justice to a legacy like that, beyond even starting to think about what it means to us.
And way less than this in that point. And, a few things I'll add to that is, I don't do this for money, nor do you. We make a livelihood, as I just mentioned, I have for over 20 years in this field. And there have been times in my life where I've had to do other things to supplement that passion and that goal. But I looked at this particular moment and I found out about it an hour or so after it happened, and we needed to come up with an obituary, not just this isn't just news, because you can look on what's trending on Twitter or Instagram and know what happened, but it's important to offer a little bit of context. And we've had this challenge time and time again of, trying to capture with a limited amount of time and the words available what somebody meant. And on this particular one with the loss of Dave, there wasn't a ton of information. There still isn't a ton of information, but also not because I could give a damn about the football game. And I live in Philadelphia, and I say that I'm originally from Pittsburgh, but that if you want to let somebody know that somebody important is gone, you have a very tight window on a day like that, where the rest of the world is turning off their computers and turning on their televisions. And so it was, I've done this at this point dozens of times. You've had to eulogize or write a memorial for somebody or an obituary. This one will go down in history for me as one of the hardest, especially coming out of an intense discussion at home and into covering somebody I knew, somebody who I hold in the dearest artistically, and then, facing that. And yeah, man, it was, even before you get to Dave's life, that challenge is no easy task.
And it's more than just a recitation of facts, right? Anybody can do that. You can go to Wikipedia and do that. Part of the reason why we're in this space is because we believe we bring a narrative, a context to this that other people might not. And so we want to be true to that and really honor the person as well, And so you talk about Dave having been a hero for you. So tell me about how De La Soul, what they've meant to you in your life as a hip hop fan.
Yeah, I've said on this podcast, and I said to you the day that you and I first met, almost 11 years, I guess 12 years ago. Doesn't matter. 2013, I think we met. I have two favorite groups, and two favorite hip hop albums, Gang Starr and De La Soul. And I go back and forth all the time on, De La Soul is dead, Balloon Mind State is right there for me, and then Hard to Earn by Gang Starr. And De La, I'm 39 years old. So I became a hip hop fan, to the fullest, where I identified that became my lifestyle and my identity the same year that Stakes is High dropped. And at that time, their back catalog on Tommy Boy was readily available at record stores. So, those 4 albums at that point just gave me a pathway of individuality. For me, coming into adolescence, I loved De La, and that they rapped about things that I could relate to, some things that I couldn't. There was a coded language there. And then you'll hear this with a lot of people and different artists, but the samples that they used on those albums, especially the 3 produced by Prince Paul, they had a reference point. And it's not just samples, it's the way that De La delivered their lines. There's a lot of, lyrical cues and references, but, it tied into my parents' music collection, as well as stuff that I heard on the radio and stuff that I knew about. And it just, the endless possibility of hip hop felt very much alive in De La Soul. And I went to some other concerts first, but I got to see them the first time I went to a huge light bulb changing for me hip hop show was in, I think, the summer of 99, maybe 2000 for Spit Kicker, which De La headlined. And that was just amazing to watch those guys perform in my hometown of Pittsburgh. It was one of the first times where I got to see hip hop live even better than it was on the album, especially with those 3 and the way they played together. So yeah, I mean, from that germination on over the next, almost 30 years, De La is everything to me. And, in the 10 years you and I have been working together, we've gotten to celebrate a really unique narrative of De La triumphing against the industry, against technology, against the powers that be. And, even with the Kickstarter era in 2015, this has been a season of a rally cry for De La. And, Dave has been a big part of that. I mean, he ran the group's social media account and was very instrumental. We can talk about that, but yeah, that's my relationship. But what about you?
Yeah, mine is different in that, I really kind of came of age with De La. We're very similar in age. Dave was 54 when he passed. I'm 53. So back in 1989, when 3 Feet High and Rising dropped, specifically me, myself, and I'm a freshman in college. And, that's a time when you're coming of age, you're becoming an adult, you've left home, you're starting to discover your identity and forge your own identity as a person. And to see De La, who had broken the ranks from what was kind of typical in rap at that point, really establish a whole different path for being a hip hop fan in terms of what you talked about, how you rap, the samples being used, the fashion, the attitude was groundbreaking. It allowed for people who were not easily, fitting into one particular box or another, like myself, to flourish and embrace our identity as kind of a unique individual. So that album was a game changer for me. But when De La Soul Is Dead dropped, a year or 2 later, I think I've told this story before. I was actually fortunate enough to have gone to the record store on a Thursday, and it was there. And I was like, yo, I didn't know De La was out. And I picked it up and then went back and was telling friends and everything. And everyone was trying to find it. No one could find it. And it turned out that the record store had made a mistake. It was supposed to come out on Tuesday, but back in that time, the shipments came early and, you held it back so you could put it first thing on Tuesday. So I had the distinction of being the only person on campus who had the De La Soul Is Dead album for the whole weekend, which was dope. And for me, then De La started to become like the Beatles in that they completely reinvented themselves every time they came out, because De La Soul Is Dead was completely sonically different than the first one. Mm-hmm. And for me personally, I much preferred that darker, kind of heavier sound that came with De La Soul Is Dead. And so that was amazing. And so they did that, kind of changed my notion of how hip hop artists, rap artists can evolve. But then they also were the ones who introduced me to Jay Dilla. I believe Stakes Is High was, no, actually, you know what? It was probably the Far Side, because Far Side with Running was 94, 95, right?
Yeah.
But I'd say Stakes Is High when that came out was probably when I was like, yo, this is different. And who is this? It really made me take note of the producer, even though I loved Running and Drop and stuff like that, but so De La ushered in a lot of things for me. So it feels like they were a companion to a lot of pivotal moments in my life, you know?
What's interesting too about them is, you know, De La really asserted the role of the album. You know, you and I have spoken a lot, and we've talked about this, of why sometimes it's important. We'll talk about this later, perhaps, you know, to compare an album from 1986 to an album from 96. And in that 10-year window, you have De La not only making each album different, you know, and I really, that point cannot be overstated, but they, because of skits, because of the way their albums were sequenced, you wouldn't just scan through to find your favorite song. You had to like press play, like it was still, you know, old school, just put on the LP and lean back. And that has a ton of value. I think every artist that puts out a project today, you know, at the highest level, dreams of undivided attention and not somebody scanning through. And, you know, in the cassette tape, the CD, and the LP era, De La did that for sure. And then on top of it, you know, just like the music having many layers, the lyrics did too. And Dave and Pastanus, you know, you listen, there's still songs that, you know, are crystallizing for me because they spoke in a lot of metaphor, not just simile, but there was a whole, you know, glossary of slang terms that they used internally for things, the three guys and Prince Paul and their associates, you know, and the whole native tongues. But I love that, you know, De La made you feel like you were in on the joke, even though it's not all lighthearted. And I think your point about De La Soul is dead. The fact that these guys were emotionally in touch with themselves enough to make an angry album. They didn't like being called the hip hop hippies, or, you know, the comparisons to, you know, Sgt. Pepper's. Like, they didn't embrace all of that. So they constantly looked at what their image was and took the reins of their own brand and made it fun, even down to their most recent album in 2016, which I listened to yesterday, which I spoke of. You know, they funded that through fans and exceeded their funding, you know, what, 2, 3, 4 times over in a matter of hours. And in doing so, I don't think they did that just because they asked for it. I think that De La succeeded in that. Even down to that, they were innovative. If you would have contributed, you know, I think it was like 1,000 to 5, some you could go record shopping with Maceo. You could, you know, I think it was Dave had a collection of boom boxes and he would give one. Like, everything that they did was fan forward and interactive, long before internet and social media. And I just really, really value that about a group. And whether you were a freshman in college or in junior high school, that relationship lasted. And that's why, again, the news, you know, those two groups I mentioned, you know, I was very much on the front lines of covering the passing of Guru in 2010. And to come back and watch one of your other favorite MCs, somebody who changed your life and had a lot to do with what I've done with my life, to write that or do that research in a matter of minutes, it's not easy, is it? I know it's not for anybody to receive that information over the last week.
Yeah, you know, so I've heard some tributes, and actually not as many as I would have hoped for, you know, about Dave, and most have really focused on De La as a unit rather than him as an individual. So I want to take some time to talk about him as an individual. You know, you want to break down kind of his.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that you say that too. Like, you know, the other great groups of hip hop. Let's look. You know, you got, you know, Outkast and Wu-Tang Clan and NWA and A Tribe Called Quest and
Mobb Deep, Gangstar. Yeah.
They all had the opportunity for solo projects, you know, some kind. You know, Prodigy and Havoc have decorated solo careers. Guru went and did Jazzmatazz. Premier produced for, you know, a litany of artists. You know, Tribe, all three of those guys, you know, not including Jerobi, but like those three guys, whether you're talking about Lucy Pearl or Tip's solo project or Fife's 2 albums, they all did things. They all had identities. And De La never, you know, the sum of their parts was always greater than the individual. And they were very deliberate about that, because I'm sure over time, especially, you know, being part of a very commercial label in the 90s, I'm sure there were opportunities there. And if not in the 90s, in the 2000s, and even in the years where De La was hemmed up by contract disputes. I mean, between 2002 and 2004, I've read that De La wasn't even sure who and if they were signed to after Tommy Boy was acquired by Warner. And then they came back out on Sanctuary with Matthew Knowles running that label. So, in that window, hip hop music industry is always looking to make a buck. And those guys never really branded themselves too much. Not for lack of opportunity. There was one project that came out about 10 years ago, Plug One and Plug Two, and that's even how they worded it. And it was a special, release of Dave and Posthumous without Maceo and another producer. It came out on Duck Down, but I wouldn't even necessarily qualify that. I think that was just an opportunity for the group to just make a little statement and as they regrouped and figured out what they were doing. But to your point,
you also didn't see the drama, that accompanies some groups. You never heard about squabbles or anything like that. They always seem to move as a unit, and before we get into Dave's life individually, other groups have had these kind of losses. We've seen that with Tribe and with Mobb Deep and others. And it has affected the groups in different ways. Tribe was able to put together a posthumous album and even tour without Five. I know that Havoc has done that too, to some degree, with guest artists and things like that. But can you see a world where De La is able to tour or continue as De La Soul without Dave, given how integral, Run DMC has done it a little bit without Jam Master Jay, but they were such a core tandem. Do you see that as a possibility?
I mean, it's so hard for me to speculate. I mean, this is coming off of, this month, Posthumous appeared, at the Hip Hop 50 tribute at the Grammys, and it was just him. And, all in the lead up, which was very short because we knew there was going to be Hip Hop 50, but we didn't know the artists until I think Saturday or Sunday. And we obviously didn't know all of them. But when I saw that, similar to Scarface being alone or Big Boy being alone, I just chalked it up to, hey, time is limited. I never in a million years questioned that, there was any reason behind Dave and Maceo not being there. I wonder, because even when De La won a Grammy alongside the Gorillaz, like they brought Maceo with them. They brought, as if it would never even be in question. Like, these are three guys, but you want to have a conversation about how some groups have kind of faded out the DJ. De La never even did that. Maceo is very much part of the unit. I'll be curious. I think maybe akin to Tribe, we might see some very meaningful performances of some kind, but imagining a world where there's a De La Soul tour like there was a few years ago with, I think it was called the Gods of Rap tour. It's all speculative, but I err on the side that I don't see that happening. They might come up with a different name of some kind, because obviously Pos and Mace, have legacy and livelihoods, but this one is really hard.
Yeah, I see it as almost like TLC, but even then it was 3 vocalists instead of 2.
Yeah.
When you go down from 2 to 1, it's just a very different entity, in my opinion.
And it's tricky too, because, Tribe, especially in their 2016 reunion campaign, they have people like Jerobi and Consequence. They have other people in the group, that can create a presence. I'm not saying they take on the vacancy, but you still get the idea of a movement. And with De La, I mean, there were other people within the cipher on certain albums, but it was really just 3 guys, always and forever. And I've yet to see Pos or Maceo speak publicly about this. So to your point, there hasn't been a lot of space for individuality in this group. And I've spoken of it other times in this podcast when we looked at the list of top 5, MCs. I think that comes at a cost sometimes to De La. And I've gone on record and said, members of the group have been in my top 5 at times, but Dave on his own, Brooklyn born, as I believe Maceo is as well, but raised in Amityville, Long Island. And these guys met in high school, really started making demos, as I understand it, in 87, 88, with the kind of energy and individuality that I spoke of. And for Dave too, David Jocelyn, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. He's a Haitian American artist. And I think that's important to talk about, especially in hip hop 50, like, this culture that you and I are part of, it comes from Black and brown immigrants, folks that came from the Caribbean, the West Indies, and brought elements of those cultures here. So I think you're remiss to talk about Dave and not talk about, some of that heritage and how it probably leads to a spectrum of other music. But yeah, when I think of him as an artist, I think of his raspy voice. And right from the onset, really pushed individuality. You take a record like Me, Myself, and I, which, is super polarizing. I think it was a reverberating song for the group that put a lot of people onto the map of De La Soul that might not have even been hip hop consumers in '89. It had a very accessible video. They had the flowers, the colors, all of that, the way that their artwork and branding was marketed. But, Dave on that joint says, right is wrong when hype is written. On the soul, De La, that is, style is surely our own thing, not the false disguise of showbiz. And like, again, that's poetry. But like, you break it down, and just there in 4 bars, they are talking about, being your own individual, not pushing the industry line, the value of inner soul, and from the onset, I mean, for a teenage MC to come out with even just a set of bars like that, let alone an album full of quotables, is insane to me. And over time, true of Pos as well, but Dave just, I think, rapped about the complete package. One of my other favorite songs of theirs is Trying People, which was later. That was the one of the AOI albums, I believe the second one. I think the second one. And, he rapped about crying, and dealing with what appears to be depression and, loved ones hurting him. And then you have joints like, and De La Soul Is Dead, where these guys let people know that they were not pushovers or suckers. So you get that whole spectrum, and you talk about being, of a similar age. You look at your life situations and your circumstances, whether that applies to, manhood and the identity of being a man, or dealing with women and intimate, like De La travels that whole spectrum as we live it. And Dave is very much at the onset of that. And, just comparing it to other groups, I would never say that there's a lead MC of De La Soul. I think Pos and Dave, as brilliantly as any group, I often maintain an outcast. I really believe that those guys are equally talented, but there's no lead MC in De La Soul. I think you look at other groups and a case can usually be made, but these guys were 2 well-suited complementary MCs that steel sharpens steel with across all of these albums and songs.
Yeah, when I listened, I've listened a lot to the catalog lately too, and I'm fortunate enough to have ripped a lot of my CDs onto digital format, so I've got the entire catalog. And I was listening to Bloom Mind State yesterday. I've listened to both Artificial Intelligence and AOI Bionics in the last couple of weeks. I'd even started that before, his passing, just anticipation of them hitting DSPs. And as I was listening yesterday, I really paid attention to how even like intra-verse they would rap together. It wouldn't be like standard 8 and 8. A lot of times one would do 4, another would do 4, or sometimes 2. And, and to me, it was almost like what Run DMC and EPMD were doing, where it's that back and forth, that interactivity, where it is all about equal. They are one unit, not like 2 guys who are rapping together side by side. They are like a truly like living, breathing organism. So I agree with that. I listened to verses like Ego Tripping, where he said, this has always been one of my favorite lines. He says, I changed my pitch up, I never did it. Right. Where other people are about being hard, they're going out of their way to say, nah, man, I'm not about that lifestyle. That's not how I rock. And, Dave, I think presented, that kind of raw side too, when you listen to Biddies in the BK Lounge and verses like that, definitely can get rugged. But, was really more showcasing the diversity rather than embracing a particular aspect of lifestyle.
Your point about the interplay is why De La had one of the best live shows in the business too. Like, I do believe that you can look at a show. I went on tour briefly, I mentioned this recently in a podcast, but in 2008, oh 08, I went on Rock the Bells for like 5 or 6 dates around the country. And on that tour was the Far Side, which is another group that, I think is a little different than De La. Both work with Dilla, but the Far Side, basically since their second album has had a lot of issues. And even going from the first album to the second album, changing producers, all of that, there's a lot of acrimony within that group, which is no secret to anybody that's been following even down to the last year. And I think that it shows in the live show. I think it shows that these are individuals that are coming together sometimes for a check. They talk about Sam and Dave, one of my favorite, soul groups of the late 60s. And those guys didn't speak the minute they got off stage after a certain point. I mean, most of their success. And I wasn't there, but I can only imagine that lends itself to everything else. And I remember seeing De La. I've seen them a number of times in my life. The love was palpable on stage, and the way they picked up off of each other, the interplay, it really made hip hop come alive on stage. And that's important to me, because I think that the greatest of the great, hip hop artists can do that. And I think there's a lot of artists that tour and don't enhance the albums and the music. And De La is an example of how to do it on the highest.
So you saw them live. Did you ever get to meet De La or Dave?
Yeah, the first time I was actually backstage at one of the Brooklyn hip hop festivals, and I was with our colleague Justin Hunt, who was interviewing De La at the time, I believe, for Brooklyn Bodega. And I walked up.
I think that was 2010.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah. It was outdoors, good weather. 2010. And he was in the middle of something, but I had never met them. I'd never spoken to them. I'd just been, a super fan. And unlike Gangstar, we're with you, and before our paths have met, I had the opportunity of knowing Guru, fairly well from a media perspective, and covering DJ Premier quite a bit over the last 20 years, but I never had met De La until 2010. So it was one of those, like, gave him dap, told him who I was, told him in a very small nutshell what they meant to me, and kept it pushing. And then I've alluded to it, but as we've covered De La's fight to own their music and get it to digital streaming platforms, which tragically, and which is very good that it's happening, but it's a tragedy that Dave's not around to see it from March 3rd. But in 2019, the very beginning of the year, I got hired by Tommy Boy Records to speak to De La and Prince Paul about the significance of it coming to streaming platforms and about the 30th anniversary of 3 Feet High and Rising. And Dave, of the three guys, was the three guys plus Paul, was the one I spoke to the most. And obviously history knows that weeks after we spoke and I began to work on this job, not only did it not come into streaming platforms, but the group, who hadn't been signed to Tommy Boy for 15 plus years, had a huge public challenge with their former label over how they were being treated, both financially and years of commentary and things like that. And so basically the thing that I worked on, I don't know whatever became of it, but those discussions, it's wild to think of, yielded to eventually what's going to get us to March 3rd. But Dave was nothing but kind, nothing but gracious, gave me so much of his time, as did Posthenouse. I'd spoken to Maceo more than the other two guys previously in the past, but De La is one of those cases where the guys are behind the scenes as they are, as you think they are, based on their music and image. And I got to tell you, as you know, I mean, that's so refreshing, because there are cases where artists that you look up to don't always come across that in exchanges. And when you think of the context of why I'm speaking to these guys, for a label that they have a long, complicated history with, and music that has denied them compensation for years and years and years, and they're cool with me just as a middleman, I think that's very telling.
Yeah, absolutely. I got to meet Pos and Dave one time. you mentioned that the Kickstarter that they did. We actually played a pretty significant role in that. I remember our post that we did about the fundraising reached 1 million people or more on Facebook. I became friendly with their manager, Brandon Hickson, at the time. I was a keynote speaker at the first Brooklyn Hip Hop Festival, kind of conference that they did leading up to the actual festival day, and met
Like
Brandon there.
2016 about?
Yeah, I think that was 2016. Yep. And but I met them later that year in August at a Samsung event, some sort of event they were doing. And like you said, man, like down to earth, super kind, very humble, very easy to talk to. I got a picture, which was a highlight, and just good dudes, man. So yeah, but I didn't have as long of an interaction as you did, which is pretty awesome.
Well, yours was in person, and I don't have a photo. And actually, I've said this before. You have kind of taught me the value of having an image, not just for reasons like this, but to document the things that we do. And my career started, like I said, in 01, 02. It wasn't until 2005 I ever asked for a photo. It was with Premiere. And lately, I don't go out of my way, but those photos mean something to me, and I'm glad that you have that. But as far as Dave, one thing I'll say is, his family hasn't released a statement on specific cause of death or anything like that. And Paz and Maceo have remained pretty much quiet during this time, which is more than understandable. But in 2016, they put out the Anonymous Nobody album, the one that resulted from the crowdfunding, and is Grammy nominated, goes to #1 on the hip hop charts when it drops. Definitely fans showed how much they missed De La. And I listened to that album yesterday at the gym, and I listened to it a lot in the year and change it after it dropped, but I hadn't in a while. But when that album released the next year, they put out a video for one of the first songs in the album, Royalty Capes, which again just speaks to De La using symbolism very effectively and kind of talking about their place in the game, even if it's challenging and murky and hard to understand. But when they put out the video in 2017, before you get to the actual music video, you see Dave at his home in Maryland, revealing that he's been battling a heart condition, and that he wears an apparatus that shocks his heart. And we covered that at the time on AFH, and very serious, because these are guys that we, had not known a whole lot about personally beyond the music. They weren't folks that, stay in the news cycle or let the public know a whole lot about what's going on, but that was a wake-up call. And in listening yesterday to that album, so much of that album is a reminder that, time is finite and legacy is important. And, everything that De La has stood for in the, nearly 7 years since that album came out really comes to life when you re-listen to it. But yeah, he was battling that. And in 2020, during a time when you and I were not publishing on Ambrosia, we thought, we'd kind of sunset the days of site coverage. Dave went back in the hospital, which was not highly reported on, but it was made public. But it's very clear that he's been battling, a congestive heart condition. And that is what I think a lot of us are, including the New York Times, are drawing comparison to, and knowing that he's not here right now. And it's important to note because, the public has been aware of this for over 5 years.
Yeah, man. You're 39, just newly turned 39, but entering your 40th year. And, what I say to people is that 40 is when the warranty expires on your body. It's when you can sleep the wrong way and end up like in pain for a couple of weeks, or, reach down to like pull up your sock in the wrong way and like have to go see the doctor and do rehab. Like 40 is when these things start to change, but more importantly, and on a more serious note, it's when we got to be super vigilant about our health, going to get checkups, our blood pressure, eating properly, exercising, all these things take on increasing importance. The day before that Dave died, I've told you, but I lost a fraternity brother, the first in my chapter to go at age 51. he'd had an aneurysm like a week before, and I found out later that he had high blood pressure and had not been taking his medication. I'm not sure if that like contributed to it or not, but you know, that's just something to say to like any listeners, man. Just take care of yourselves, go out, get that annual physical, make sure you're getting your blood work, do everything you can, because it's not, we can't take it for granted.
No, yeah, I shared with you, but you know, I turned 39 last month, and I made a pledge to myself that I would turn 40 in better help with, or you know, better health of what's within my control than I did at 30. And you know, I'm making a lot of lifestyle changes with that in mind, just because, you know, in the process of getting married and potentially expanding the family, let alone just the people I love and care about, I want to be here. And I have a father that's had some health conditions recently, and, you know, is regularly talking about this being, you know, a closing season of his life. And that affects me greatly, just knowing that. And I also know I'm so blessed to have a father at this point in my life. So I look at all of that and take audit, and more than, I mean, as much as that, I should say, is, you know, so many of our professional friends, so many of the artists that we're inspired by and look up to, you know, we're covering or reading about on a daily basis. And, you know, death is all around us. And I think we all need to just do what we can to choose life.
Yeah, man. So on a positive note, what are some of your favorite Dave verses?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Balloon Mind State, IMIB, like, that's probably my favorite De La song. You know, you spoke about what you learned from Ego Trippin'. That song may as well hand you a manuscript of how to live your life. And I love that joint. Trying People, I think, just shows the depth and range. And, you know, when people act like vulnerability is new to hip hop with the late 2000s, that's a great example of why that's not the case. It's been around for a long time. That chippy side of Dave, I listened to the Grind Date on Friday night, and Verbal Clap, I mean, he really shined on that album, and he shined on Balloon Mind State. And you know, I was reading a lot of the other retrospectives, and you know, I mentioned the Me, Myself and I, but also you know, in that dark period for De La, when they weren't, you know, able to put out albums regularly, and they were just figuring out the group, they won a Grammy with the Gorillaz on Feel Good Inc. And, you know, Dave did what Dave does in a lighthearted way on that song. And that Grammy, I know, means something to De La, especially when they had been slighted and snubbed so many times just as hip hop artists. So I think that needs honorable mention. But you mentioned a few, but what are some of your other ones?
Yeah, IMIB is definitely up there for me too. I mentioned Stakes is High. You know, Biddies in the BK Lounge for me is a wild one, because I don't recall ever hearing a song like it, you know, before or since. You know, it's just a random exchange between him and a person working at a Burger King. I mean, like, that's just such a weird idea. It makes you think, is this like based on reality? But like, to put it in a song and filled with humor like that, incredible. It's one, and also, you know, just the beat changes and everything in that song, but his verse kicks it off, and super dope. You know, Baby Fat from AOI Bionics is another one where, you know, celebrating body positivity before that was even a term of art, particularly for Black women, you know, accepting your natural self, which I think was a very powerful message at that time, especially from a rap group where rap is, you know, seen to be so misogynistic. That was a really big one for me too. Ego Tripping, I mentioned before, you know, for all those reasons. And then Break of Dawn, just because that's another one where I think he and Pos are back and forth, like we talked about, in a really cool way, where it's not 8 and 8, it's like, you know, 2 and 2 or 4 and 4. And, you know, that one just speaks to me as well. So yeah, those are some of the ones that stuck out for me.
Biddies in the BK Lounge, my first like real, like, you know, punch clock job was when I was 16 working. It was the summer that I saw De La live for the first time. So it was either 99 or 2000, but I was working in a Burger King. And I used to walk to work with some of my coworkers that happened to be women. And that song has special meaning to me. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, as everybody knows, this is the 50th. We're coming up on the 50th anniversary of hip hop. August 11th, 1973 is the date when Kool Herc and his sister Cindy threw a party at 1520 Sedgwick Avenue in the Bronx. And man, oh man, oh man, everyone in the world is starting to like perk up and take notice of this anniversary right now. We saw an amazing 50th anniversary tribute at the Grammys, curated by Questlove, featuring, was it like 17 different acts?
I think 18 by my count. Yeah.
18 acts, like it was like 17 minutes long. It was spectacular, and cut down from Questlove's initial vision of 100 artists in 27 minutes, like the ultimate mixtape.
Yeah.
But who knows, man? There's a special coming up on CBS, a 2-hour special on August 11th, which may allow him to kind of deliver that in full, which would be pretty cool. But one of the things that has come out, so Billboard, and I think it was Billboard that did a list of the top 50 MCs last year as well. Was it Billboard? Well, they've done one in conjunction with VIBE, where they've listed the top 50 MCs. And these are often humorous. I think a lot of them are done just for clickbait purposes. The one last year was insane. I think it had Cardi B at like number 14 or something like that. And above Rakim and some other like pretty notable Ice Cube. I think like it was really questionable. But this one is interesting. I think that the collaboration with VIBE, and I know some people who worked on it personally, helped because the top 7, regardless of kind of order, it's really kind of hard to dispute that these 7 MCs don't belong in that 1 through 7 range. But there's some other ones that are head scratchers. So just want to kind of quickly go through this. They had Jay-Z at number 1, Kendrick Lamar at number 2, which I'm sure infuriated a lot of people, particularly like the older heads. Nas, Tupac, Eminem, Biggie, and then Lil Wayne coming in at 7. Interestingly, right after Wayne is number 8 is Drake, and 9 Snoop Dogg, 10 Nicki Minaj. So let's talk about the top 10 first, and then we can kind of go through it and talk about other stuff. So how did the top 10 strike you?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you said. I mean, that first 7 is kind of a version of who's your top 5. Like, that question and why we did a special episode during 2022, aggregating all of the artists that had listed their top 5s, is because it's kind of with slight variation. Obviously, you're getting 5 out of 7 or so MCs, but those are the names that we so often appear. And I have to say,
let me ask you this whilst Theo is making his cameo. So one of the things I would attack like right off the bat is whether or not Wayne and Drake should be swapped. So listen, I know Wayne's impact is particularly different than most. I think I wrote an article way back when that he was one of the first ever to have a major comeback. Most artists, they had a peak in their career and then they kind of sunsetted afterwards and never really rose to the same kind of fame that they had before. Wayne, though, debuted, particularly with the Hot Boys and, stuff like Bling Bling in the late 90s. But I would say his apex was in the mid to late O's when he had a solo career, kind of resurrected himself with mixtapes, just like all over the place. And then the Carter series is what really kind of took him to a whole different level, with the Carter 3, I think, being the peak of that, dropping 1 million in 1 week, album sales, that is. So taking nothing away from that, right? And Wayne has been prolific. He's been on 1 million different features and things like that. But Drake, first of all, let me say the criteria for this were body of work / achievements. And by achievements, it's charted singles, albums, gold, platinum certifications. Second criteria is cultural impact / influence, how the artist's work fostered the genre's evolution. Third is longevity, years at the mic. Fourth is lyrics, storytelling skills, and then flow for vocal prowess. So those being the factors, even with longevity, you know, so Wayne's been around, call it 24 years, you know, 24, 25 years now. Drake has been around for 14 years, which is not a small amount of time to have, like, you know, amassed a career especially when you compare
Even longer.
Tupac and Biggie.
Yeah.
Right. When you compare like Tupac and Biggie, who like many revere, but the reality is that both had careers of like, you know, 5 to 7 years. So Drake coming in at double that. And then when you list the actual certifications, there's no artist in history that has had the certifications that Drake has had, period. Like no rap artist for sure. And it's a different era, right? So like in the streaming era, no one is even remotely close. If there is an equivalence, he's approaching like literally like Michael Jackson level in terms of like his commercial impact. And so that being said, like I think
we did a podcast with that very theme, and it got us more negative likes than anyone ever.
Yeah, but it is what it is, man. Numbers don't lie. Like I said, there's the equivalence. And so, you know, it's a different world with streaming, but at the same time, it's also different in that you've got a million different things that can distract you and take your attention versus, you know, X amount of radio stations and like X amount of record companies and TV stations and so forth. It was just, it's, you can't equate the two eras for many reasons, but I think there's pros and cons to, I think there's reasons why you could argue that it's more tough this day and age. So what Drake is doing is even more impressive versus you could say, no, people were opening up their wallets and like buying albums and stuff like that. So, you know, I think it's there are arguments on either side, but in any case, Wayne and Drake, I think are in a much more similar era, and Drake has dominated not only Wayne, but just about everyone on this list in terms of that era.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not mad personally over Wayne above Drake. And I, given the criteria that you just read, I'm not at all surprised nor angry. I'm not angry about any of this list. I could give, but, you know, I think that Wayne, from the perspective of as an MC, as a rapper, has driven culture more than Drake, even if Drake has had more success. And let's not, you know, Wayne's apex, I would say, is right around Carter 3. You know, in terms of,
give me examples of that though. Give me examples of how he's driven culture.
I think people rap different because of Lil Wayne, including some of the people above him on this list. I think Wayne's style of rapping has not only influenced Kendrick Lamar, but I think that it for a time challenged Jay-Z to switch his flow. That's just
face tats, skateboarding culture.
I'm even like going.
Face tats are common now. Most people did not have face tats before Lil Wayne, and now it's like all over the place. So
yeah, but even in my explanation, I was going more on the side of rapping. I think you make a valid point. I think that, you know, Wayne's not just skating, but like his fashion sense and like leaning into, you know, wallets on chains and just kind of like for a time, you know, loose fitting clothes and all of that. Like Wayne had that command on things. But if I'm really using the rubric of rapping, because I think that Drake has influenced culture crazy. I mean, undoubtedly, he's been, in my estimation, you know, the biggest superstar of the last 10 years plus. And you could make the case that it's been closer to 14. But I don't know if Drake's drive of culture shows itself musically as much as it does in other ways. Like,
well, let's go back to the criteria though, right? Because
the Billboard
is there is there a reason why you think cultural impact outweighs body of work / achievements? Because I think in terms of body of work achievements, Drake beats everyone on this list in terms of charted singles, albums, gold, platinum. That's just fact. That's not even speculation. You know, he destroys everyone on this list just with that. Cultural impact, I think Drake has had a ton of impact on artists who've come after him. I think a lot of people, he's, you know, changed music, not just for rap, but in general. He's brought world music in. He brought like a lot of the British influence in. I think, you know, I won't say necessarily style, but like, you know, musical style, I think is impacted. Longevity, Wayne's got him there. lyrics, storytelling, I think Drake has more diversity in his subject matter and the way that he delivers his content versus Wayne, who's much more about punchlines. And then flow and vocal prowess, I think they're probably about even on that one. So to me, it's between cultural impact and achievements. And do you think that any of these criteria should be worth more, weighed heavily more than others, or do you think they're all kind of the same, or it's a
interesting
calculus?
because I asked myself that with longevity, and you look at an artist like Biggie that was really around for 2002, like Party and Bullshit till the day that he died, and the life after that pullout. Yeah, like a 92. Yeah, you got like a 5-year window, and Biggie is sitting at number 6 on here. But then the longevity of Biggie is bigger than those 5 years. Like clearly, what Biggie means to the heart and soul of hip hop goes incredibly beyond that. And I do think that Wayne, although Wayne, hasn't, there comes a certain time around 2009, 2010 where Wayne, shifts gears a little bit and Drake just continues a meteoric rise. But I ask myself that to answer your question of how longevity factors in here. I think you make a really valid point, in terms of the records that Drake has, commercial records, streaming records, chart records. It is different though. I mean, like, I am curious if music, if you're comparing a Drake to a Tupac, where in 96, people had to go to the store and buy the album to show that level of support, to push an album to diamond, how that looks different for an artist like Drake, because you're going to have a curiosity element that wasn't always possible when people didn't have access to every album that dropped on their phone. That's just my belief. I still say, like, I'm not personally upset at Wayne above Drake in these rankings. Wayne's been around longer, significantly longer, as you brought up. And that point of time between, I'll say 2005 and 2009, 2010 for Wayne was just insane, but it's not going to be measurable the way that Drake's impact has after a certain point, because so much of what Drake does shows up on the chart, shows up in the plaque, shows up the way that it does, which Wayne's apex was really 2 Carter albums to me and a host of mixtapes that just got the streets ablaze and shaped culture around them. That's my 2 pennies.
Yeah, I mean, for a moment in time, it's just, I can pull up I just sent this to some folks recently too. Well, let me go to my bigger point. So we say we're not mad at this top 7, right? Do you think that everyone in this top 7 has an argument for being number 1? That's 1. 2, I think that Drake, out of all these people, has like the biggest argument of possibly being number 2. I think above Kendrick, when you think about Kendrick, I think gets elevated because of and this is interesting because this isn't like one of the criteria, but I think it's like critical acclaim. Like, if you count critical acclaim as cultural impact, because I'm not sure that Kendrick has fostered the genre's evolution, because I don't know that people are trying to play in Kendrick's lane as much. I think Kendrick is carved out his own lane, which I believe is a continuation of Andre 3000's lane. And I don't know that many other people are trying to be Kendrick. I do think a lot of people have tried to be Drake, have tried to be Migos, have tried to be, artists kind of in that category. So when you think about just this criteria, and again, this is not my personal list, I'm really just arguing based within this framework. I think there's a very strong argument that Drake is number 2 and challenging for number 1. I don't know that you can make that same argument for anyone else on the list, given this criteria. But what's your reaction to that?
Just so I hear you correctly, are you saying Kendrick number 1 or keeping Jay-Z at number 1?
I'm saying that Drake, by their criteria, I would put it number 2, and is the only person I think who could credibly challenge for number 1. And my question to you is, is Drake. I think Jay is number 1 based on this criteria. And I think that Drake is the closest to challenging that. But do you see others as potentially being number one on this list?
Based on the way you just framed that, I think you're onto something. I think Drake could be number one. I personally believe that Kendrick deserves in that conversation too, but my reasoning is not part of the criteria, and my reasoning is consistency. Every one of these artists has put out a misfire in some way, with the exception of Biggie, who only lived to put out an album and a double album, and then the Junior Mafia project, which I wouldn't weight against Biggie's discography. Kendrick, in my opinion, since Section 80 has not missed. You know, everything he's done has been to the highest level. He's advanced with it. I think every one of these other artists has times where they've had a misfire and had to figure it out. But again,
I hear that, but I want to stick to this framework. This, you know what I mean? Like, because we can both listen. We can both have our own personal list, and mine is going to be different than this. But just in this framework, you know, do you think that Kendrick is there? Because again, critical acclaim is not even listed here, right? And consistency is not listed. I think in those two boxes, there's no one who outshines Kendrick. So if those were two criteria, then I think Kendrick, you know, but those aren't two of the criteria here.
I think that those two, Drake and Jay-Z, are in a league of their own. I think that for a time, Eminem was there, and Eminem, I would say, is probably third on that list, based within that framework. But what about you?
Yeah, I mean, so let me just read this this Drake entry from Wikipedia. It says Drake is the highest certified singles artist ever in the United States, having moved 142 million units based on combined sales and on-demand streams. That's artists, right? That's not rap artists. That's not that's just artists, period. He's the highest certified artist in history. He holds several Billboard 100 Hot 100 chart records. He has the most charted songs of any artist, 258. The most simultaneously charted songs in a single week, 27. The most debuts in a week, 22. The most top 10 singles, 54. The most top 10 debuts in a week, 9. The most top 10 debuts total, 39. And the most continuous time on the chart, 431 weeks. He has accumulated 10 number one singles, a record among rappers. You know, look, I could go on and on, but just commercially speaking, he is so far ahead of anyone else that you know, I think that starts to tip the scale, you know, given that he's not far behind in other factors too, you know. And so everyone who's ever listened to this podcast knows how I feel about Kendrick, and you know, I think that he and Jay, you know, I think Jay is the GOAT personally, and I think Kendrick is a close number 2. So this list actually kind of aligns with mine. But, you know, in terms of the criteria, I think it's really, really tough to make an argument that anyone besides Jay-Z should be ahead of Drake on this.
Why do you think, just in your own estimation, why Drake is at number 8 based on the case you just made?
It's an interesting question. I think that these lists, even the people who make them, sometimes lose sight of the criteria, you know, and ultimately it kind of becomes about one. I think a lot of times it's about clicks. And the one that we talked about last year was, I think, deliberately controversial in order to generate conversation. This one to me feels more intentional. And I think that they probably were judging this list based on different criteria than they listed. That's my guess. What do you think?
It's challenging too when you have multiple people working on a list, and I don't know how you know, ultimately the rankings were decided. Again, you said it, but there's people that I admire and respect that worked on this list. There's people that I've worked with closely in my career that worked on this list, contributed. Yeah, I mean, I think your assessment is probably accurate. One of the things that I found a little bit concerning about this list is at the top of it, they made clear that this was North American rappers. And they used Slick Rick as a deliberate example of why Slick Rick is not included, because he's British born. Slick's, you know, Rick's not on the list, nor is MF Doom, who's British born, nor is 21 Savage. I thought that is an interesting criteria. I mean, I understand that there are artists in other countries that make a lot of noise in their respective communities. But why do you think that was such a factor? And do you believe that a Doom or a Slick Rick or a 21 Savage should be treated as English artists?
So it's an interesting question. The thought that I had when you said that was, oh, that's the Bad Bunny rule. I think that, Bad Bunny, if you classify him as a rapper, right, is the biggest artist in the world right now. And so given that criteria, would have to be on this list and probably pretty high because he's been doing it for a long time too. So I think that was their way to try and make it truly about kind of traditional rappers. I do think, and I wonder even if that would rule out like a Doom, because Doom, even if he was born elsewhere, grew up in the U.S. Same with 21 Savage. You know what I mean? I think
kind of.
Say again. Say again.
Same with Rick.
Right. So, yeah. So I think that was kind of a cop out for like, oh, we're not going to include some of these guys. But I don't know that Doom would have been on the list at all, or 21 Savage.
Under that criteria.
I think they had boxes they wanted to check. And, we want to have X amount of representation from the 80s, 90s, O's, is one box. They want to have both genders covered, or male and female rappers covered. And so we have Nicki Minaj at number 10, which you put in, you think is too high. I think that is too high as well, particularly given, well, all the criteria, right? Like to put Nicki ahead of Kanye, period, Kanye, 50 Cent, DMX, who else? Even Lauryn Hill, right? Like Dr. Dre. And let's talk about that too. Like, how important do you think it is that people write their rhymes? Because Kanye and Dre being on this list.
And Little
yeah. Yes. So I think they were trying to check some boxes, you know what I mean? And that led to some kind of wonky placements. But what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in the different factors of that criteria. Because if you want to talk about cultural impact and influence and longevity, Dr. Dre, you can't have at the bottom. But also, I think we're all aware as hip hop fans that, okay, Dre doesn't write his own rhymes. He's always been perceived as more of a producer than a rapper, although he has at least 2 classic solo albums, arguably, I would say. There's just a giant disconnect here. One of the things that's big on here is Snoop Dogg is number 9. And I think if you saw an MC list stated that way, seeing Snoop Dogg at number 9 would raise an eyebrow. But if you want to talk about longevity and impact, I mean, Snoop Dogg's hand is in everything. But with that, if we're going to do that, one of the people that has spoken out against this list is Ice Cube, who's at number 18. So, and I look at both Cube and Snoop as guys who, started with hip hop, obviously have classic albums under their belt, and then have done all of these other things. But to have that kind of a disconnect in ranking, it just gets confusing to me, especially without more of a rubric for explanation.
Yeah, let me ask you this. So again, body of work, achievements, cultural impact, influence, longevity, lyrics, and flow. Do you think that had Kanye not had the year he had last year, he would be ranked higher on this list? Because, I mean, he checks off all those boxes in a major way. And sales and cultural impact, it's hard to say there's been anyone bigger in terms of cultural impact in the last 10, 15 years. So what's your thought on that?
Absolutely. I think so. I think that anytime you come out with this list, you're dealing with a little bit of politics. Because you know that the fourth wall is going to push back. You want to accommodate that. And we are not in a season, and deservingly so, of giving Kanye flowers right now, when he's brought a lot of shame to his own legacy. So yeah, I think 100% that ranking shows of like okay, Kanye's here, but nah, we're gonna look at the guy whose business is just falling apart right now. It's been a minute since he's made, a truly great album, in my opinion, and a lot of people's opinions, so they put him there. That's what I think.
All right, so you put a question in our prep of, do these do more harm than good? So we've attempted to answer this question, AFH, as well, but we did it in a very democratic way. We said, let's not us kind of like opine from on high, because everyone's got their own opinions. Let's get the opinions from millions of people who are like steeped in this culture, who love it, and let the people decide who's number one. And when we did that back in 2015, the people decided Eminem was number one, Tupac was number two. Those would not have been our choices, but I actually am not mad at either one of those. And for a while, it was pretty neck and neck between those two. Do you think these do more harm than good?
I think they ruffle feathers. And let's not forget, I mean, Billboard and VIBE, although, they're under the same umbrella these days, are two very different publications. I mean, Billboard has always been about commercial success and, charts and radio exposure and all of that. VIBE from inception was a very, very different publication. But I think that you put these out, and I have to tell you, I mean, Jay might have thought it was cool. I don't know that Kendrick cares. I don't know that Nas, feels the way. Number 3 is pretty honorable. Tupac and Biggie aren't here, and I don't know that Eminem gives a damn. So you honor that, but what you end up doing is creating a lot of discourse, which is good because it brings attention to your list and your brand. But the loudest voices I've heard in this conversation are not people applauding this list. They're people that are saying, you forgot so-and-so, you didn't even include, I don't like my ranking, I don't like my favorite artist ranking, where is my bandmate? And, in the name of Hip Hop 50, in the name of celebrating this thing, I think that gets a little bit, it's a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, I think it could have achieved what it wanted to achieve if done without a ranking. Now obviously you're still going to get people feeling like they're omitted from the list. But if you do it without the ranking, if you just listed these 50 artists as the top 50 artists of the last 50 years, I think it's a pretty strong, almost bulletproof list. I think it's very difficult for people to argue that the list as a whole is not a good representation of the greatest artists in this genre. I think the ranking is where it starts to get, in trouble.
I think that's a good takeaway. I mean, one of the more innovative things that I've seen in the last decade with this is Complex, another publication, we respect, people that we've worked with contributed to this list, but they did a rap yearbook of since 1979, the year of Rapper's Delight, the biggest MC, the biggest rapper of that particular year. To me, that was really interesting. And of course, there were repeats. There's still discourse. I believe they went to the trouble of kind of posting runners up. But that's an innovative way of doing this. All respect to Billboard and VIBE and the people who worked on this. But this discussion continues all the time, and it always will. It was 2019 when, was it Ebro kind of kicked things off with the best rappers list, and everyone was posting their note cards. And we, AFH covered Mike Tyson's, we covered, a few different people. And that was a great way to show folks our own personal opinions and where we differ and argue. But there wasn't a rubric. That was purely subjective. But when a publication does it, even in laying out that and kind of the way you and I are kind of not arguing, but debating and questioning somebody like Drake's rankings, it just gets super murky. But I think you're absolutely right. The ranking is what makes that really challenging. I came up with some, but were there names that were missing on this list that really kind of were your immediate takeaways?
Yeah, I do think that Doom was a big one, because Doom, so I get it, right? Where Doom is lacking according to their criteria is the commercial sales, because Doom was 100% underground, but his influence was so off the charts, pun intended,
Yeah.
that I think there's, so again, I would want to know, I'd want to have a better understanding of how they weighed these criteria, if they were meant to be equal or if it was meant to be a calculus. And so if you over-indexed on one, you could under-index on another and so forth. Because if that's the case, then I think Doom absolutely should be on here. Everyone else, there's an argument for tons and tons of people here. And, I'm looking at your list and, if every single one of those people was on the list, I'd be cool with that. And you can read that. But I also, to some degree, I'm okay with them or, probably 25 others not being on the list, just because when you think about it, when you step back, there's probably 100 to 150 artists who equally deserve like this top 50, categorization. And it's really just kind of random. There would be obvious omissions if you didn't have Jay, you didn't have M, you didn't have Biggie and Pac, and pretty much everyone on the top 10 except for like Nicki in the top 50, you would look crazy, right? But I think there's an argument for a lot of these people. But you wanna mention your list?
Well, yeah, I mean, in brief, these are the names that jumped out at me, and I'll just say, Fat Joe made the point, and it's February, it's the month we lost Big L, and I believe the month he was born, but Joe said Big L should be on this list. I looked at it and I thought, in the wake of obviously what happened, but even if this list came out January, I feel like Dave and Posthumous make deserving cases to be there. Q-Tip is on the list. I was curious about DMC. You have Rev Run on here, but no DMC, no Too Short. You have somebody like Bun B who, expanded hip hop sound regionally and in terms of its music. Bun has platinum and gold plaques, but at the same, you have talk about longevity. Too Short's been putting out stuff since 1982, so omitting that is interesting to me. The fact that you have Ghostface but no Raekwon, and then there's just a list of people: Pharaoh, Corrupt, Big Boy, Tretch, Royce the 5'9". I'll say Fonte, Elzai, AZ, no Cool G Rap, no Cool Keith, no Guru, and no MF Doom. Those, and I hear you, not all of those artists may fit that criteria, but again, when I look at a Bun, a lot of those artists have plaques, have noteworthy songs, and by no means am I decrying Bun, but it gets a little bit murky when you get to the bottom of the list. But let me ask you, with the idea of a DMC or a Raekwon or a Big Boy not making the list, but having their counterparts on it, do you think that there's an element of, okay, we put on Rev Run, so we don't have to put on DMC. We put on Jadakiss, so we don't have to put Styles.
Maybe, but it's weird. I just had this conversation yesterday, man. It's interesting for me how in these groups, I think a lot of us tend to gravitate toward one MC more than the other. For me, I was always a bigger fan of Phife than Tip. Respect Tip, love his voice, but Phife was the guy for me. And Andre is the guy for me. And for Run DMC was the man for me. No disrespect to Run, but like DMC is what made Run DMC to me. So I don't think it's, and so I can understand, and we didn't talk about this, but like, the Ghetto Boys, Scarface and Willie D had a pretty public exchange about the fact that Scarface appeared on that Grammy tribute without Willie D and performed My Mind's Playing Tricks on Me, a Ghetto Boys song. I don't think it's enough in those instances to just include one. I think even if, and to your point about De La, with the Gorillas, with them bringing up Mace, even though he wasn't a part of that project, I think even if the person doesn't perform and is there almost like in a hype man capacity, you at least show that respect that this was a group effort. And so I think in these instances, you see sometimes ties on these lists too, right? So I think that it would have been okay to have both listed at a particular number, because the truth is that for a lot of these groups, one doesn't exist and one doesn't have the acclaim without the other one. And so I would like to see Big and Andre recognized in their slot, and Run and D in their slot, and Dave and Pos in their slot, and so forth. I think that would be a more artful way to handle it.
Interesting. One other just question, and then I think we can move on, is, this list has Curtis Blow at number 23. And, Curtis is credited with the first solo artist with a gold album, if I'm not mistaken. You know, he did a lot of commercial breakthroughs for the culture, but he's above an artist like Melly Mel, who came in, I'm looking for Mel's ranking, at number 48. Does that give you a sense of what this list values versus what it doesn't? Now, I know Mel and Curtis are contemporaries, but I think that one is revered lyrically differently than the other.
Yeah, I think again, this is checking boxes. This is a really weird one to me, and that's the thing. You made the point about like different people who made the list, maybe like leaning into different criteria. Maybe whoever did this portion was more into the sales than the impact. But I don't know that Curtis Blow, I know Curtis Blow had the first album, and he may have had the first gold or platinum single. But I know the message is one of the biggest records like of all time, both commercially and critically, and completely changed the course of rap music. Without the message, I don't know that we're here, because it made rap relevant, So to have Curtis Blow ahead of Melly Mel is a head scratcher for me, and to have him 25 spaces ahead is, I think, really, really wild. Like I think there's an argument for Melly Mel being in the top 20 for sure, maybe even a little bit higher. So
yeah,
that one was a head scratcher for me.
We agree. And one of the things, and this isn't to play the AFH trumpet, but I will in one instance, when we in 2014 did our first ever Finding the GOAT, the one you spoke of that Eminem ultimately won, that list began, I forget what the number was. It was damn near like 100 of how many artists we pulled from. Do you remember?
No. It was like 168.
Yeah, it was insane. And with that,
yeah,
we tried to, highlight the Daves, the ecstasies from Houdini, the Rev Run and the DMC. And I think that that's important when you have these discussions too, which is a perfect bridge between what we spoke about earlier of you take a group sometimes and it's hard to recognize the individual. You look at some that just have a standout lyricist, but in other cases, it gets super duper murky. And when you start to rank, there's a consequence that crews can suffer. So yeah, I think we agree on that very much.
Yeah. Yeah, man. So let's move on to some other things that happened this week. There's some business moves that are really, really interesting. First of all, Jay-Z sold the remaining stake of his a liquor company, right, for another like $500 million or $600 million to so Jay now has liquidated over $1.5 billion in the last year and a half or so, between the sale of Tidal and sale of one portion of his alcohol brand and then the other half. So man, he got a war chest right now. I'm wondering what he's saving that up for.
Think it's going to be a sports team?
Maybe there's some speculation about that. But right now he couldn't do that because of Rock Nation. Because Rock Nation has a sports agent component, and so it'd be a conflict of interest. But if Jay, if you see an announcement about Jay selling his Rock Nation Sports soon, you know exactly where he's going with that one. So yeah. But interesting, he's always making moves. But on the other side, so Quality Control, this is the label owned by Coach K and P, that has artists like Migos and Lil
Baby,
Lil Yachty, City Girls. Who else?
Little Baby for a time.
Lil Baby, right. So, among some of the biggest artists of the last like 5 years, or 5 to 7 years, and very distinct sound, Atlanta-based. There's a great documentary on Lil Baby on Hulu that I watched. Encourage you to watch it, even if you're not a fan. It's got a real interesting life. But these guys, have been making moves. They've been branching out into film and TV recently as well. But they sold their company, Quality Control, to Hybe American, which is a South Korean company, for $300 million. Scooter Braun, manager to Justin Bieber and Kanye at one time, and lots of huge stars, is the CEO of North American branch of Hybe American. And so the deal is that P and K, Coach K and P will continue to maintain control over quality control in conjunction with Scooter Braun. So, reporting into Scooter Braun, but my guess is that he will kind of let them do their thing. I know that Scooter Braun is the manager for Quavo too. So I know those two have been doing business for quite some time, probably have similar vision. The label launched 10 years ago, back in 2013. But it's interesting for me because $300 million is a lot of money, right? But when you start to think about the impact of those artists and the catalog that they have, I start to wonder, is it the proper value? And I really start to wonder that based on the backdrop of how Black-owned labels have been valued in the past. But before I get into that, what's your take on the sale in general?
It's I dealt with Coach K a long time ago when he was still working with Young Jeezy, and to watch these guys turn from, music executives into building a literal empire in 10 years is insane. And I'm impressed. It's wild, but it also comes at a time where it a little bit makes sense to me. I mean, everyone is aware when you hear the name Migos that, November of last year, Takeoff passed away. I don't know what the future looks like for that group as a group. Obviously, Offset and Quavo have very successful solo careers. But that's a big question. And, Offset was recently in a legal battle with QC over the ownership of his solo material. There have been some of the artists, between Lil Baby and Yachty, you've heard grumblings over the years of, renegotiation and dissatisfaction. So if you can bring value to a brand and sell, I think it makes sense. And not for nothing. I mean, these are two men. They have to be suffering and grieving of all that's transpired just over the last 6 months. And so if you have an opportunity to at least take it out, but still do what you want, but know that you've monetized it in a certain way, I can empathize with that. But I think to your point, the value is the part that I question.
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally understand the timing. And listen, I don't know the numbers. I don't know what their market share was. So it's quite possible that not only did they get full value, but they might have gotten a great deal. These two strike me as great businessmen and have done very well over the last 10 years, to your point. But history has not been favorable to Black-owned labels in terms of valuation in the past. So, just as a couple of examples, back in 1999, Def Jam sold the remaining 40% of its stake to Seagram's for $100 million. And at the time, they had Jay-Z, Method Man, Ja Rule, and DMX was signed and about to have a huge run also. So, even though Def Jam had kind of a lull in the mid 90s, this was when they were kind of at their apex commercially. I don't know that they were ever bigger than they were at the time. And listen, 40% for $100 million. So, roughly like $225 million valuation for the entire label, something like that. But when you reflect that against Interscope back in 1996, so 3 years before this, and just for people, the record industry kept going up and up until 2001. 2001 was the apex, and then everything crashed. Clive Calder, who was the owner of Jive at the time, cashed out infamously for $2.1 billion, I believe it was, at the very height of the market. You had Britney and NSYNC and a lot of like big artists at that time. And he had what's called a put. He was able to force RCA to buy his stake at that time, and he got out just in time, and the bottom completely collapsed with Napster and stuff like that. But so in 1996, presumably the market was not as high as it would have been in 1999. But Interscope sold 50% of its stake to MCA. It's actually a deal that I worked on as a lawyer for $200 million. So, they're selling, Def Jam sold 40% for $100 million in 1999. Interscope sold 50% for $200 million. So, that's a huge discrepancy. That means they were valued at like $400 million versus like, Def Jam's 220 or 225 or whatever the math is. At the time, Interscope had Death Row, which, obviously was colossal. They also had acts of their own, like No Doubt, Nine Inch Nails, and Bush. But, that one always struck me as like a moment, like, Def Jam, even if their market share wasn't as big, the catalog they had over 20 years was huge. And now, especially in years like now, when we're celebrating the 50th anniversary, we understand the value of that catalog and what that means, for sync licenses and, and soundtracks and commercials and all this other stuff. Another example is Motown. And like, I don't know that there is a more pristine catalog of music than Motown. It's still played at just about every wedding. You've got, Stevie Wonder, Jackson 5, Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson. It's music that has endured for 60 plus years. Marvin Gaye. I mean, like, it just goes on and on. Motown sold to MCA in June of 1988 for $61 million. Okay. And so now that's 1988, right? So, okay, we were talking different numbers, adjusted for inflation and all that stuff. But contrast that to Geffen. David Geffen, business magnate, sold to MCA in 1990 for $550 million in stock. And, that value grew to $850 million in 1991 when MCA was purchased by Matsushita, a Japanese company. At the time, they had Guns N' Roses, they had Don Henley, Aerosmith, Whitesnake, Peter Gabriel, Cher. They had 8% market share that year. It's one of the largest independents. But, $850 million for Interscope, for Geffen, 3 years after Motown sells for $61 million, and the catalog that Motown has for like decades and decades, something smells off to me, So, traditionally, I think Black-owned labels have been undervalued despite the impact of the music, the commercial sales, the longevity. So that's the only thing that makes me question whether or not, and I hope K and Coach K and P did get the valuation, but again, history has not been kind.
Yeah, I mean, that Motown point and even that Def Jam point, because, we've covered it on the site, but in 98 leading up to that sale, Def Jam, went balls to the walls. Like Foxy Brown tops the charts, Ja Rule, 98 kind of makes his push. DMX had 2 charting albums that year, number ones, with It's Dark and Hell is Hot and Flesh of My Flesh. You had Meth, like everyone, Jay-Z, we haven't even gotten to Jay-Z yet. Like they were crushing things. And you're talking about 100 million, which is 1/3. And now I know that was 25 years ago, but that was 1/3 of what we're talking about with QC now. And then you made a tremendous point of like, did that business value Def Jam's archives, here we are, Hip Hop 50, to tell that story and not talk about LL Cool J or Beastie Boys or EPMD, like so much stuff that's come out on Def Jam over the years. It's insane. And the David Geffen to Berry Gordy, to compare those two things side by side tells a wild story. Yeah.
Yeah, man. Yeah. I was reading Billboard religiously at the time, and those were always two things that struck me,
No one was calling that out at the time, right?
Nah, no one was, but for me, it was always like, I wonder, it didn't feel right, it just didn't feel right.
Well, something else that you mentioned earlier that didn't feel right is the way that the media and the words that they've used have portrayed another, like what should feel like a good move. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, you talk about the move first, and I'll get into the part that kind of rubbed me the wrong way.
Absolutely. So Pharrell Williams, you want to talk about longevity. Really, I think Pharrell is on a 30-year victory lap right now, going from the Neptunes to becoming a solo artist, producing stuff in hip hop and R&B onto some of the biggest records, just period, anywhere. Pharrell has his hand in anything and everything and continues to just maintain the highest level of quality. And, you and I were speaking earlier and talking about the Billboard list of the things and the feats that artists accomplish. I referenced, Snoop and Ice Cube taking rap music and going on to do all these other things as others have. Pharrell has a new huge feather in his cap. He is the newest Creative Director of Menswear at Louis Vuitton. I'm trying to say it like you say it. And yeah, the menswear Vuitton. And you know, that role obviously replaces the late Virgil Abloh, who became, you know, the first person to call, first Black man to have that job previously, just something we reported on AFH.
Yeah. And so, listen, Pharrell has a history with LVMH. In 2004, he worked with them, and I think in 2008, and then he's worked with Tiffany, which is also part of that company. LVMH is Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy, owned by Bernard Arnault, a name that I must confess I didn't know until Kanye started talking about him, but he is currently the wealthiest man in the world, which, you know, says a lot about how huge that company and what an honor it is for Pharrell to get it. It's considered maybe the most powerful position in men's fashion, you know, certainly for the biggest line. So, and Pharrell has always been one of those, like, who has, you know, really impacted culture, you know, going back to that. Like, his style has been completely unique, from his hair to what he wears. One of my favorite stories is I went to an after party that Puffy had after the VMAs. I think it was 2004. And Puff had sent out these invitations where he was like, ladies, get your waxings, your pedicures, your manicures. It's like, fellas, like, you know, put on your finest suits. I mean, Versace, like Polo, like, you know, Ralph Lauren, like, you know, that kind of thing. Don't, you know, no jeans, no bumminess, right? And so I'm standing in line, and, you know, I got on my tux and everything. And Carson Daly, who's the host of TRL at the time, comes up. And he's dressed nice and everything. And he's got some friends who wearing some jeans. And he's like, they say, no, I'm sorry, you know, that they don't mean dress code. And he's like, yo, do you know who I am? I'm Carson Daly. And it's like, yeah, you know, okay, you can come in, but your friends can't. Right. And so he said, well, you know, he says, well, they're not coming in. I'm not coming in. He leaves. Of course, 5 minutes later, he comes back solo and comes in. Right. So I'm in there, and dude, there's food everywhere. There's lobster like on the table spread around. There's the finest champagne and everything. And everyone is dressed to the nines. Incidentally, I'm on the dance floor dancing right next to Joey Fatone from NSYNC and Giselle Bundchen, formerly Miss Tom Brady. You know, and I look over and I see one dude who was just straight violating dress code, like just reckless, like without, and the only dude in the entire place, right? But, you know, also noting that, damn, I'm at a Puffy party and the last 12 songs have been produced by the Neptunes, right? And so I see this dude, he's got on a cargo hat, t-shirt, and some like jean shorts, or like, you know, cargo shorts, and Tim's. And it's Pharrell, right? You know, and he had the right to do that because he was running the radio at that time, you know. But even in a situation like that, he's gonna be the dude who's the outlier, you know, the one who's like marching to the beat of his own drum. And he's done that time and time again. You know, his work with Ice Cream and Billionaire Boys Club, like he's been at the vanguard of fashion. So well deserved.
Did you have one of those big hats back in 2010?
I did not. I did not have one of those derby hats. No, sir.
No. I don't. Oh yeah, the derbies, and yeah. Did you ever a hat?
No, sir. No.
Neither.
I'm not a hat. I'm not a hat dude. I wear a beanie when it's cold, and that's it. And I call those skull caps anyway. So, yeah, man. So, two things. So, one, I wonder if this had gone to Kanye had he not been so radioactive. But two, the thing that disturbed me is that in the lead, like both above, just below the headline, and also the first description in the initial paragraph, the New York Times described him, and I quote, Pharrell Williams, the American rapper and producer. So first of all, like, you know, you talked earlier about not being a blogger, right? And how that puts you in a box that doesn't really recognize all the things that you bring to the table and what you've done with your career. The term rapper, man, has been used. It's such a loaded term by mainstream media because to me it feels like a stereotype that is not quite positive, especially the way that most rappers have been portrayed in the media as like, it's usually in connection with some sort of violence or some sort of crime or something like that. Secondly, Pharrell is a producer of music, a producer of film, a fashion designer, an icon.
He's been producer of the year at the Grammys. Like,
Yeah, a creative director, a singer. He is truly a multi-hyphenate in like the purest definition of the word. So to call him an American rapper as the first thing, I think is like I found it very off-putting. Later on, they said, and they were talking to him and they said, still Mr. Williams' appointment to the pinnacle of high-end ready-to-wear underscores an apparent trend among luxury goods makers to put their futures in the hands of multi-hyphenate celebrities, not designers by profession. So listen, they had that in the vocabulary. I don't know why they didn't use it up top, or just say Pharrell Williams, like, personality or whatever. So, that was the only thing that like kind of like made me like take pause. But, you think I'm overreacting to that or like?
no, I think you make a really good point. And for me, it's funny as a writer, when you're writing an article, I find that I have to use the word rapper, but I try not to use it first, unless for one occasion. If there's an artist that something happens to, that's name could easily be confused with somebody else, take a Q-Tip, take Dave from De La Soul, like just the idea of Dave. There's several rappers named Dave. You can use it in those situations, but that is only when you need to. But to call Pharrell Williams, who record, like, that's his name, that he's not somebody who could be mistaken for anybody else, and to qualify him as a rapper, that's really cheap. And especially from a publication that I hold in high regard. I listen to Daily most mornings and all of that, and I think there's a lot about journalism that I learned from the Times. That was cheap. And yeah, I think your comparison to being called a blogger, being called, calling LeBron James a basketball player, like you are reducing somebody in a way that's unnecessary.
Yeah, and it's not even what he does primarily musically, right? It's first producing, secondly singing. Third is the rapping part,
Yeah.
So even if you're gonna put him in a musical box, like, and then to your point, why not just say artist?
Right.
Like then, like, which is what he is. He's an artist. He's an artist in many genres. So yeah, but in any case, salute to Pharrell. Let's go back to my Kanye question though. Do you think that had Kanye not gone off the rails in the last 2 to 3 years, shall we say, that this would have been a role that was offered to him?
I don't know. I mean, Kanye had a lot of different pots in the stove. He had to deal with Gap. He obviously was doing what he was doing with Adidas. I don't follow the fashion world closely enough to know if that would be a detractor. Obviously, in the case of Virgil, Off-White just continued to rise even after he was appointed director. But with Kanye, that I would imagine would be a concern for them. And then for Louis Vuitton. And then secondly, do you really want to end up with somebody who's very publicly trying so hard to be with you? I mean, before Virgil had passed away, just weeks and months before, Kanye had made commentary, including if I'm on Drink Champs, if I'm not mistaken, of why he felt that should have been him. And I don't know, like, you look at a luxury brand, you look at what that means, what prestige and power and fashion and flair looks like. I don't know if you kind of, forgive the analogy, but like, give the baby its bottle. That's why I think Pharrell is a really interesting choice and a deserving one. But
yeah,
you ask me a question, I'll ask you a question. With Virgil, it was different, and Virgil still, after that appointment, was designing album covers for West Side Gun and was able to do so many of the things he had done before. Do you think in the wake of this appointment, it will pull Pharrell away from music for a time?
I don't. I think Pharrell has been doing so many things. He has truly been a multi-hyphenate for so long that this is just another ball in the air for him. In some ways, he's another person who's had a major resurgence. A lot of producers, they have an era, and then after that era, it kind of wanes for them. But he had that era from like, call it, 1999 or so until I don't know, 2008, whatever. Like he had a long, long run with the Neptunes, but then he had another run, man, in the mid 20 teens up through the present where he's just been on a tear. Some of his biggest songs ever, Get Lucky,
Happy.
Happy, have been like in that period. And so um, I think he's capable of doing anything he wants, regardless of what else is going on. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think he'll continue to do music.
I'm always curious what that looks like. Like clearly that would be a very high paying position, a very powerful, important position, as you stated. But like, as somebody, you and I both have, a few different pots on the stove and in our lives and in our professional lives. And I always wonder, when you're busy, like making a Kendrick Lamar album, or you're busy doing this or doing that, how these other entities try to kind of give you the nudge of like, hey, we still got a season coming ahead or something like that over here. But I just have to speculate on that one.
Yeah, man. So a lot happened this week. Anything else you want to? There are a couple of other business moves. You want to talk about those real quick?
Yeah, 50 Cent is now secured a deal with the Fox network, which brings G-Unit Film and Television over there. I think this is interesting just on two levels. Number one, our colleague Justin Hunt did a really interesting TBD on the resurgence of 50 Cent and what an upcoming album and music means to him. I think any hip hop head can agree that since 2007's Curtis, 50's just gone in other directions. He still will drop songs. He had a big record with NLE Chopper not that long ago. But his bread and butter is now film and television, and Power's done what it's done, the BMF series. But now, he's at Stars, or he's at Fox, which is interesting because for all the years that 50 was at Stars with those two programs, he was very competitive with Fox and their show Empire. So to watch him in pure 50 Cent style go at somebody and then ultimately end up there is just kind of the latest of a power move. And, we don't know what this is going to be next. Fox has not given him exclusive, so he can still make deals other places. It says that it may be scripted and animated, but it just shows you that, there's other money out there besides music, and 50 Cent is king of that. And that's kind of my takeaway. What about you?
Yeah, I think it's a major move, man. As successful as his work at Stars has been, and he still does, he still will be involved with that franchise. So it's kind of the best of both worlds. Network TV is just different. It's a much, much bigger platform. He has opportunities to launch something maybe off of a Super Bowl, which could bring, tens of millions of people to his viewership. So I think that the audience that he'll reach will dwarf that. I'm curious, though, as to the other thing that comes with network, though, is more parameters around the standards and practices and the content. So I'm curious as to how he'll be able to show edge in the same way that he did with his star shows where there aren't those kind of restrictions. But aside from that, man, I think that 50 just, stays winning.
And not for nothing, Fox as an entity, nothing says that 50 wouldn't launch something on FXX or you know what I mean? Like he has the opportunity to still do some of those things because some of those networks have different parameters under the Fox umbrella, right?
Yep, for sure.
Do they have an next Super Bowl?
They have it every 2 or 3 years. It rotates between the networks, so they'll definitely have it sometime in his cycle. And I got to think, given development and it takes like a year or two to produce something, it might be right around then. So,
Word. Yeah. Is there anything else in the last week that's really jumped out at you?
yeah, the Fight the Power documentary, I didn't even know about this until it showed up in my YouTube feed, which is a shame, but it's a 4-part documentary on PBS, executive produced by Chuck D and Lori Bula. And Man, it is fantastic. I produced a 4-part documentary for BET in partnership. I helped to produce one with a bunch of people, but wrote for that called The Message. So I know how hard it is to put these together. Just getting all the talent and shooting, but then taking all those hours of footage and making them into like a cogent, cohesive storyline is difficult. So I always appreciate seeing other people in their process, but it's really, really well done. Goes back into I think 1950s and 60s leading up to the circumstances that helped to birth hip hop. Has a lot of great personalities in it. Chuck D's obviously featured, KRS, LL, Fat Joe, Eminem, DMC, Melly Mel, Nelson George, the writer, Lee Quinones, who was graffiti artist in the movie Wild Style. Our colleague Soren Baker, Sway, a bunch of people who are really heavy hitters. So I encourage everyone to check that out. You can watch it on YouTube or Amazon Prime or PBS if you want to go old school. But that's it. That's it for me, man.
I really I love it. And I can feel Chuck D's fingerprints all over it, because it's very like, there's a canon of great hip hop documentary that I believe starts with Style Wars and into, the show and Rhyme and Reason and Scratch. And you and I were big supporters of Hip Hop Evolution on Netflix. And this is great, but there's a huge socio-political component that deals with racism and classism and the bigger powers that be from politics on down. And I love that. Like, that's what Public Enemy and Eminem says it in there too. Like, Chuck D taught him that line about Elvis and why to reconsider somebody he had looked up to, which is complicated in the wake of what Eminem, worked on that soundtrack last year. But it's great history that you're not going to get in textbooks and in school. Like you, I was a little bit late to the game and being able to watch it. I have my Uncle Dan, who had been texting me like 3 or 4 times, like, check this out. And it's phenomenal. And the music and the way they wove in the music into the documentary is very stylish and rhythmic, and it's just got a lot of flavor to it. So it's really, really high-end art for me.
Yeah, man, for sure.
So yeah, man, I think that about covers it. Do you have a song of the week?
Yeah, man. You're probably gonna take this too, but it's gonna be I Am I Be for me, just once again, rest in peace to Dave. Super bittersweet that their music is coming on to digital service providers in the next couple of weeks, actually. But at least he knew that was coming, and I think it helps to cement the legacy of De La Soul for many generations to come, and that's one of the finest for me. How about you?
You know me very well. That was going to be my song, but in the interest of that and just how this week has felt in the wake of this news and just all the emotional processing, I'll go with Trying People. Another De La joint, but both of those songs are must listen to, and some of the first that I will be seeking out on March 3rd. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. All right, man. Well, until the next time.
Yes, indeed. Until we do it again. But thank you, everyone. Oh, and if you made it this far, please like, review, comment, help us spread the word with this thing. We don't do it if not for you. So shout out to the listener as well and the viewer.
Word, for sure.
Well,
all right.
peace.